Okay, so here we are on the second video for the heart. Now we're going to talk about the chambers of the heart and also the valves between the different chambers. So the heart has 4 chambers and it has 2 atria and 2 ventricles. So we have the right atrium. Atrium would be the singular version of atria, which is plural. So the right atrium and the left atrium, and then the right ventricle, and then the left ventricle. Now, both of the atrias have the same general function. Atria receive blood. So veins taking blood back into the heart are going to be connected to atria. So blood going into the heart to the atria first, whereas the function of the ventricles is to pump the blood away, right? So atria will be connected to veins because veins bring blood back to the heart, and ventricles will be connected to arteries because arteries will bring the blood away from the heart. Okay, so atria receive, ventricles pump. Now, separating the right and left of the atria are called the inter meaning between, interatrial septum. A septum is a division, and inter means between, so the division between the atria. And then between the ventricles, this nice thick layer of muscle, myocardium right there, that's called the interventricular septum. Okay, so again, the division between the ventricles. Okay, so the right and the left sides of the heart pump to different places. Okay, so let's start with the right ventricle. This function of the right ventricle, remember, ventricles pump away, but the right ventricle pumps to a different location than the left ventricle. The right ventricle is going to pump to the lungs. Okay, so it only goes to the lungs. And so that's called the pulmonary circuit because pulmonary means lungs. And so right ventricle to the lungs, and then it's going to come back to the left atrium. From the left atrium, it'll go into the left ventricle. So the left ventricle is going to pump to the aorta to the whole body. So that's called the systemic circuit because systemic means body-wide. So we have 2 circuits. So I sort of think of it like a figure 8, right? So pulmonary circuit to the lungs, back to the heart, then the systemic circuit to the body and then back to the heart, and then it just sort of continues on like that. Okay, so 2 different circuits, one to the lungs, pulmonary, one to the whole body, systemic. Okay, so this is because the right ventricle and the left ventricle pump to different places, they require different amounts of muscle. So if you look at what we're looking at right now here is if you took the heart and you just sort of cut the top off of it. So it would be a transverse section through the heart, and so that you can look down into the ventricles. So here is the right ventricle. And this thick one right here, so this chamber right here would be the left ventricle. And what I want you to notice is look how thick the myocardium is in the left ventricle in comparison to the right. Why do you think that is? Okay, it has to do with where they pump. So the right ventricle only pumps to the lungs, and remember the lungs are like right here, right next to the heart. So they don't go very far distance, and so they don't require as much force to overcome the resistance to get to where they're going. Whereas the left ventricle, that's responsible for the systemic circuit, which means it has to pump to the entire body, all the way up to the tippy head, all the way down to the tippy toe, going the entire place in the body. That's a much longer resistance, a much longer distance, a lot more resistance, and therefore requires a lot more force to get there. And that's why the left ventricle is going to be much thicker. Okay, so the left ventricle will have a much thicker myocardium so that it has enough force to do the systemic or the body-wide circuit. Okay, so if I were you, I'd see if you could write that out, right? So why is the left ventricle thicker than the right? It has to do with where they're going. The left ventricle goes to the whole body. The right ventricle is only pumping to the lungs. Okay. On to the valves. the function of all valves, and this is true not just for the valves in the heart, but also valves in, for example, the veins that we'll talk about later on. The function of all valves is to make sure that the flow is in one single direction, because you want to make sure the purpose of the heart is to keep the blood moving. And you need to make sure that it's not going to try to travel backwards. You want it only moving in one single direction so it can make the entire circuit. So that's the function of all the valves. Same function, all the valves. There are two types of valves in the heart. You have two atrioventricular valves, also known as AV valves, and then you have two semilunar valves, also known as SL valves. The atrioventricular valves are called that because they are between the atria and the ventricles. Okay, so see these two right here? The one on the right side is the tricuspid valve, and the one on the left side is the bicuspid valve. So the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve, both of those are atrioventricular valves. Then we have two semilunar valves, and the semilunar valves are going to be between the ventricles and the arteries. Okay, so you have the pulmonary semilunar valve between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery, or pulmonary trunk also. The aortic semilunar valve, which would be between the left ventricle and the aorta. Okay, so I'm going to go through that again. For the atrioventricular valves, remember, between the atria and the ventricles, on the right side is the tricuspid valve. On the left side is the bicuspid valve, also known as the mitral valve, although honestly I really prefer to use the word bicuspid because I like how it's kind of mirrors the tricuspid, right? So they sound similar, so I can remember that both of them are AV valves. Okay, but you can use mitral, but I will probably use bicuspid, so you need to be familiar with that term as well. Okay, so I like to remember that the atrioventricular valves, you're going to try it on the right, bi it on the left. Okay, so sometimes it's really difficult to remember which side it's on. Try on the right, bi on the left. Okay, so the tricuspid valve would be on the right side, and the bicuspid valve would be on the left side. Okay, you can also think of try before you buy. Tricuspid valve on right, bicuspid valve on the left. Okay, another thing that I need you to know is some other structures that are associated with that. So let's look at tricuspid first. So why do you think it's called tricuspid? Okay, so a cusp is a flap, little flap. So this part right here, this solid looking part, that would be the cusp, and it's called the tricuspid valve because there are three little flaps. Okay, so tricuspid, three flaps. And for the bicuspid valve, what does bi mean? Bi means two, so that means that the bicuspid valve only has two little flaps. Both the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves, they also have these little strings, your heart strings. Those are called chordae tendineae. Okay, so chordae tendineae, and they are, the function of the chordae tendineae is so that when the ventricles are contracting, the blood is going to try to go back towards the right atrium, and it'll fill up those little cusps. It'll be anchored down by the chordae tendineae, and that's going to make sure that the cusps don't fly up into the right atrium. Okay, so both AV valves have chordae tendineae. And it's important because the semilunar valves do not have chordae tendineae. And so that's going to be a really big help when you're trying to identify the valve. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky to figure out which one you're looking at. If it has chordae tendineae, it's one of the two AV valves. If it does not have any strings on it, it's going to be one of the semilunar valves. Okay, so again, the semilunar valves are going to be between the ventricles and the arteries, okay, and their name just comes from which artery they're connected to, either the pulmonary trunk, also known as the pulmonary arteries, and the aortic trunk, aortic valve, which would be between the left ventricle and the aorta. Okay, so again, no strings. So the way that they work is if you look at them carefully, they're called the semilunar valves, lunar as in lunar, as in moon, and they make little crescent shapes. So think of them sort of like upside down parachutes. So when the ventricles contract, that's going to force the blood through the valve, okay? But when the ventricles relax, the blood is going to try to come back into the ventricles. And instead what's going to happen is it's going to fill up those little cusps, those little crescent moons, upside down parachutes, and that's what closes the valves. So the AV valves close when the ventricles contract, and the semilunar valves close when the ventricles relax. Okay. I also wanted to mention those heart sounds because, well, mostly I think it's interesting. So usually when you listen to the heart, it sounds like lub-dub, lub-dub. And most people generally assume that the sound comes from the contraction of the chambers themselves, but that's not actually true. The sound comes from the closing of those valves. So the first sound would be the closing of the AV valves, because that's what happens first in the cardiac cycle. And then the second sound, the dub, would be because of the closing of the semilunar valves. Okay, so lub-dub, lub-dub. Okay, so which one of those valves have those chordae tendineae? Remember, it's only the atrioventricular valves between the atria and the ventricles. So it would be just the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve. The semilunar valves have no strings attached. Okay, I'm going to stop for now, and you can go on later.